If I were the devil. If I were the devil. I can't imagine being any more pleased with my strategies for keeping Christian light under its bushel. Since my agenda is to have the people of every nation ruled by the worst possible tyrants that the people will tolerate, since my agenda is to have the people of every nation ruled by the worst possible tyrants that the people will tolerate, my first priority would be to get the citizens with the most light in the freest of nations to hold their church under a bushel dark enough to keep their light from shining on their nation. And what greater cause could I have for laughter and merriment were I the devil than to get these Christians to justify their bushel with spiritual sounding non-involvement theologies that rarely, if ever, quote the Bible, and to present their non-involvement theologies with my favorite sin, pride. First, I would invent the Jehovah's Witnesses, which reverences almost the same Bible as other churches, but which was born with a heavily entrenched non-involvement theology against voting or serving in the military. Then I would work to spread that non-involvement theology across America's churches for the next 70 years until 1953, when I could find a senator corrupt enough to put in the IRS code something that made it seem illegal for a church to let its light shine on the nation. Then I would build on that for the rest of the century until only a few churches were left whose pastors occasionally preach what God says about the sins which government has chosen to protect and promote, and until none are left whose members are welcome to discuss how to organize against the sins identified by their pastors, because that would offend listen to this, that would offend church members who don't agree with their pastors and who still vote for their government to promote those sins. Much less are members welcome to discuss what God says about political details not addressed by their pastors, and to try to agree and organize action to do something about them. But all that work still leaves a small number of Christians committed in their opposition to some government-protected sin. So how to neutralize them? I would invent the lesser of two evils theology. Brilliant! I would give them all kinds of spiritual-sounding logic that would relieve them of having to ever get out their Bibles in its defense. You know, God's goal in 1 Samuel 8 was the most righteous leadership that the people would tolerate. My goal as the devil is the most wicked leadership that the people will tolerate. In other words, God's goal was the lesser of two evils, and mine is the greater of two evils. By getting God's people to refuse to vote for the lesser of two evils, they are out of the way for my voters for the greatest of all evils. Perfect! Even their sermons and messages are made so much easier for their nation to ignore because they make themselves politically irrelevant. That is, they sever the link between words and actions. as the saying goes.
I come to land where the people are happy, where there is so much opportunity. I get a job, I work hard, I pay taxes, but one more thing people say to me. They tell me that in line like everybody else. You are legal, you fucking follow that smell. Why no army, folks like me expelled, get in line like everybody else. I ask lawyer where these lines I can't get in. Fill out forms and my fees I begin. 20 years later the court's still deciding if I'm in line but still I can't win. They tell me get in line like everybody else. You are legal, you fucking follow that smells. Why no army, folks like me expelled, get in line like everybody else. Well, 15 years now I'm finally a people. I'm still in line, 30 years more I vote. 13 years more my wife can pump.
Perdão, Sanchez.
She knows swing, she can ride in the fall. But folks say, get behind me in bureaucratic hell. You are legal, you fucking follow that smell. Why no army, folks like me expelled, get in line like everybody else.
Both sinners, babies would die under
Ándale, ándale. Arriba, arriba. Marchando, bandido.
Immigration laws are like a speed limit, 5 miles an hour on the interstate. We should be ashamed of ourselves to defend it. Fix those lines so no lifetime we wait.
Get in line like everybody else. You are legal, you fucking follow that smell. Why no army, folks like me expelled,
Get in line like everybody else!
yet. That will be my next project. I would tell them that 1 Timothy 2 verses 1 to 2 tells Christians to pray, 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 and pray. And never to physically communicate with political leaders or even with each other to agree on what goals we ought to pray for, even though the verse actually lists 3 other actions defined as communication both with God and men. And even though Matthew 18:19 says one of the keys to answered prayer is Christians praying for the same thing, so that our prayers are not at war with each other. When he said, if 2 of you shall agree as touching anything that they shall ask, well, that requires discussion of what those 2 want God to do, right? But they don't know that, and I ain't going to tell them. This the devil. I know Christians wildly differ in their vision of what government ought to do, making it impossible for God to answer their contradictory requests, which is one of the meanings of James 1, verses 6 to 8. So I would tell them the reason they should not allow discussion about their wildly contradictory goals for government is because the discussion would be controversial, which would violate in 2 Controversies 3:16, right? And the best part, the most fun of all this, for me, if I were the devil, most of God's light bearers, believe me,